Pediatric Lounge, a podcast taking you behind the door of the physician's lounge to get a deeper insight into just what docs are talking about today. From the clinically profound to the wonderfully routine and everything in between. Good morning, George. It's Tuesday morning. It's great to see you once again.
Good morning, Dr. Bravo, or Bravissimo, as I call you. Today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Jessica Schleider, and her topic today will be Single Intervention Scalable Solutions for Depressions. I just discovered that she works over at Stony Brook, our neighbor, and it's a small world, but it's a Long Island.
So welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. For our listeners, if you don't know Dr. Schleider, she's near dear to my heart because she's joining Dr. Renat Bedas, who has been in the program before, one of our first shows with her father, Sadi, at Northwest, and they're going to be doing some great work with a medical school in Chicago. She is a fascinating individual. Her pedigree is unbelievable. She trained with Dr. Jane Gillham, and then she's been at Yale and Harvard, and she has developed simple interventions through her lab that can change the outcome of depression and anxiety in children. And she's here to talk to us about how we can bring that into our practices and tie us over when we have a depressed adolescent in the office. So let me ask you first, what was the biggest takeaways from working with Dr. Jane?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Dr. Jane Gillham is the reason I'm doing any of the things I'm doing today. She was my undergraduate research mentor at Swarthmore. A funny thing about Swarthmore is it's so small and there are no graduate students, so the professors sort of treat the undergraduates like graduate students. I didn't know that at the time, but I was very, very lucky to be in that situation. So I went to her office hours after taking one of her courses in my freshman year, as much as humanly possible. And eventually she got the hint and invited me to her lab meetings. And I worked with her for 3.5 years in college, working on school-based depression prevention programs, both co-facilitating intervention sessions with middle school students and helping with data analysis, preparing ethics protocols, and even doing my senior thesis with her using some of her data from the Penn Resiliency Program, which was a large school-based study for preventing depression in teens. So I totally got enamored with clinical research and alternative approaches to treating mental health difficulties in teens, in this case, school-based interventions. And the main takeaway from working with her for me was the incredible importance of mentorship. The fact that she took a chance on me, an interest in me, believed in me more than I did myself at the time, gave me grace and patience when I had trouble giving myself those things in college. That meant the world, and it helped me believe that I could actually do the researcher thing, the scientist thing.
She gave you hope.
Exactly. She gave me hope that this was actually a thing that I could do, self-efficacy, which is exactly what she specializes in. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But absolutely, she gave me hope and a sense of agency, a sense that I could do it, that I could take actions towards this goal for myself.
Wow. Now, I doubt there's any pediatrician that doesn't know about the book, The Optimistic Child, that was co-written with Marty Seligman out of UPenn.
Yeah.
And for those few people in the world who haven't heard of these two people, they're part of a new movement, which is not so new anymore, called positive psychology, where we look at the science of hope, agency, and your personal strengths to build upon your own strengths to be able to reach your best self, or flourish, as Marty will say, right? And that's the foundation of the book. And then they went a step further and they developed programs which they teach the teachers, and the teachers then teach the children.
Right.
So that's where the scalable part comes from.
Yes, exactly.
And for the life of me, I don't understand why that's not standard curriculum in every public school in America with the epidemic of depression and anxiety, gender dysphoria, suicide, just general unhappiness that we have when our tweens and teens. And the lack of ability for the pediatrician to manage that, and the lack of resources on cognitive behavioral therapists in our communities to help us do that.
Mhm.
I don't understand it. But that's
Yeah.
the premise of the book, right?
Exactly.
Now, she used the word optimism. And I think we've evolved. We no longer think of optimism, faith, and hope as the same thing.
Right.
So, what are the differences between optimism, faith, and hope?
Sure. So optimism, as it's used in Jane Gillham and Marty Seligman's book, is referring to a way of understanding why events are happening to you in your life. Another way of describing it is an optimistic explanatory style, the way in which you explain the things that are happening to you. An optimistic explanatory style is when you view adversities as things that are temporary, specific to the situation, and ultimately external to yourself, not caused by you as a person. Whereas a pessimistic explanatory style would be viewing adversity as something that's permanent, something that's pervasive, as in one adversity will impact all aspects of your life, and one that's personal, as in it's a reflection of who you are. One
So
kind of way.
let me interrupt you there for a second, because I'm much more simple-minded than you are. So if I, when we say pervasive and local, as opposed to what I call global,
Yeah.
well, if I was going to go out for a bike ride today and it starts storming,
Yep.
and I thought, oh, geez, every time I want to go out for a bike ride, it rains on me.
That's exactly, yeah.
That I'm making that personal,
Mhm.
and I'm saying it's not going to change, and it only happens to me.
That's right.
But if I was to say, well, it's got to rain because the grass needs some watering, and I still have tomorrow because I have some time in the morning to go for the bike ride. So I'll just work on the podcast today and switch over to the bike ride tomorrow.
Yes.
That would be, I'm not taking it personally. I think the circumstance can change. And it's just a thing that happens in the world. It's not unique to me. Is that
Precisely.
the difference?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a perfect
All right.
description.
And sorry to interrupt you. You're going to say more.
Oh,
So,
no.
so that's the key of optimism.
hmm hmm
And now
And
we've learned. Yes, go ahead.
oh, yeah. So you asked about hope and how that's different. Hope is really just the more basic core belief that things can get better in the future for you. So it's much less multifaceted, much less complicated than the sort of concept of optimism that they talk about in the book. It's just the basic belief that things can get better, which, as it turns out, has a massive impact on what you do, how you think, and how you feel, especially in the face of stress.
Yes. And so we struggle a lot. And this is a struggle that is significant among women physicians. And you have to understand our demographic. About somewhere between 50 to 70% of pediatricians are women.
Mm-hmm.
And we are a minority specialty. So only about 30% of the American pediatrician are white.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing a tremendous lack of engagement about 4 to 7 years into the practice of women pediatricians.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, in my mind, one of the reasons is lack of hope.
Yeah.
You see a depressed patient, you see an anxiety patient, you see a patient that, is struggling in school, and we have to see 25, 30 kids a day.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the time to talk to them. We don't have
Mm-hmm.
the time to empathize with them. We don't have the time to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have anyone to hand off that patient to
Right.
improve their existence. And at some point of doing that day after day, you lose hope that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem for us. And I don't have a solution as to how to rebuild that hope for the American woman pediatrician, but it is of paramount importance because every child needs healthcare.
Of course. And every pediatrician needs resources and supports that fit into the context that they're in. Otherwise, you end up in this demoralizing situation where you're asked to do things that are not possible to do.
Correct. And how does hope intersect with both anxiety and depression in the adolescent brain?
In teenagers who are experiencing things like anxiety and depression, thinking about the future is really difficult. It's really hard to take yourself out of what you're experiencing at the present and imagine a future in which that's not as intense, in which your depression symptoms aren't as severe. Things tend to feel permanent when you're in a lot of distress as a teenager. And in graduate school, a lot of my early research was looking at teenagers' beliefs about the permanence of depression and anxiety, and seeing emotions, seeing sadness, seeing anxiety as something that's just a personality trait, something about you, is really strongly linked to having more severe symptoms of depression and anxiety over time. So it's a reflection of how you're thinking about whether your symptoms can change. So if there's hope that your symptoms can change, you tend to do better. You tend to cope in different ways that lead to better trajectories and outcomes for you. If you think that your symptoms can't change no matter what, you're not going to try very hard to cope with them, because what's the point? So that's sort of the intersection that I've been working on and that a lot of our brief interventions tend to address.
And then not only thinking about your best future self, but agency, getting moving, is very helpful to these kids.
Absolutely. And it's linked to hope in a major way. So if you believe that not only is depression something that can change over time, but that actions you personally take can be a part of that change, that's extremely empowering for an adolescent to experience and feel. If they think that they can do something that will have an effect on how they feel in the future, that's a huge difference, miles difference from thinking that no matter what you do, depression could happen to you and could stay around no matter what. So helping people identify the actions they can take to get out of these spirals that they find themselves in, especially teens who may not have observed themselves doing that before. It's really powerful.
And so it's very difficult because adenamia, or what we used to say, there used to be catatonic depression before the SSRIs. People were literally in a corner sitting and they wouldn't move.
Yeah.
Luckily, we don't see that since the SSRIs came about.
Yeah.
But people don't understand the person that's depressed really can't move.
Yeah.
They physically can't move. It's not get out of bed, go for a bike ride, come back and we'll have breakfast. They
Yes.
struggle to get up to go to the bathroom.
Yes.
And I think we as professionals are not very kind because we've been beaten up so much. You know, you work for 36 hours, doesn't matter if you didn't eat, doesn't matter if you didn't sleep. The patient's sick, you take care of the patient that's sick. Don't whine, don't complain, do it.
That's right.
So it's hard to empathize
Yeah.
because we've been told to shut our feelings down and just do what's right for the kids.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get someone, for example, that's in that stage? Which was your favorite way of doing it? For example, SMART is one technique.
Mm.
Small, measurable, actionable, reasonable, accountable goals.
Yep.
What other suggestion do you have? Because it's got to be small steps, not big
Absolutely.
steps.
Absolutely. And in our single session approaches that we teach clinicians, including pediatricians, how to do with kids, helping your patient realize that a small step is not only possible, but you've done it before, is a really key part of inspiring that hope for change. So one of the single session interventions that I've developed and that we've helped people to deliver is based on solution-focused therapy, a little bit different from cognitive behavioral therapy. Solution-focused therapy is helping people recognize the strengths and the skills and the capacities they already possess, instead of trying to teach them brand new skills that they may not be comfortable with. So it's helping people remember and mobilize their inner strengths that already exist for them. And by introducing the idea that big change is simply a series of small changes, and any small change can actually have an effect that you notice on your well-being, we actually help people make action plans to get one tiny step, the smallest possible step that you can detect, towards a goal that matters to you right now. And we can make an action plan with them, a 3-step action plan of things that feel, of course I can do these, because they've done them before, or because they reflect inner strengths or things that they've relied on but maybe didn't remember. And helping people simply see that there is a path to even the smallest possible improvement, simply because they've done this before. They've been in a slightly better place before. That helps reorient the person in front of you to the possibility that things can change. And that's a little bit different from creating SMART goals. SMART goals tend to be a little bit more long-term. Sort of, goals over the course of weeks or months. Whereas the single session consultation, which is what we call this program, is focused on what can you do today?
Okay.
Not even going past today. What can you do today that you will notice and that could make a change in this problem you're facing? And we find that is sometimes a necessary first step, because even SMART goals sometimes are too big and too overwhelming for someone experiencing depression to believe that they can really do.
Okay. And is this what your workbook for teens is all about? This alternate solution? And how would I incorporate that workbook into my practice? When I see an acutely depressed patient, they usually don't really want to engage into anything. I usually use Lexapro to get them started, and I see them in a week. In about 2 weeks, they start somewhat engaging. Sometimes not till 6 weeks. When do you think I take the workbook out and hand it to the parents and say, we need to work on this?
So there are a few different options that my lab has developed, including but not limited to the workbook. And I think they're good for different circumstances. For pediatricians who want to give kids something on the spot that they can do that is low risk, that is low commitment required, we actually have free single session online programs that teens can do on their own that don't require talking to a person, and that teach in really bite-sized elements individual lessons from the workbook. These interventions teach the simple idea of, because of how the brain works, change is possible. So just planting that seed, that's one of the interventions. Another of the interventions simply teaches the idea that what you do can shape how you feel because of how brains work. So really going back to neuroscience, and helping people take one step towards seeing that for themselves. Another single session online program teaches about self-kindness and why, even though you may feel like being mean to yourself and critical and hard on yourself is actually helping you reach your goals. That's why a lot of people get stuck in those cycles. It's actually the opposite of that. And being kind to yourself is a much better way to achieve your goals. So these bite-sized lessons, which can be completed in 15 or so minutes by teens on their own, are free. They can be completed anonymously, and can be offered by pediatricians on the spot to teens. Those are things that have been tested in randomized trials. They've reduced depression, anxiety over months compared to control conditions. and they've been used by thousands of teens across the country. So those, even more so than the workbook, which, thinking about where a kid with depression is at cognitively, a workbook can feel a little overwhelming because you have to think about doing the
Right.
whole thing.
Right.
This is a 15-minute commitment,
Yes.
and an evidence-based 15-minute commitment. So that might be a better first step.
Okay.
If they complete that intervention and say, you know what, that actually, I kind of liked it, that might be an opportunity to introduce something like the workbook, which just requires more motivation at the start.
Okay. So I'm going to put an ad for your lab. Okay. So 1, it's free. 2, it's anonymous. 3, it has multiple languages.
Mm-hmm.
Spanish is important, but you have a couple other buttons I can't read. So what languages are there?
Yeah, so we've been really lucky to work with collaborators all around the world. At this point, we have Haitian Creole, Spanish, English. We're working on an Israeli translation. We're just finalizing that, Hebrew. We have Arabic, Turkish, and really these have all emerged organically from folks across the globe who recognize that our interventions have an evidence base and they're free, and they want them to be available to kids in their countries. So we're really excited to continue expanding. We have a Mandarin translation underway. It's very exciting to be involved with.
That is, I don't know, how do I say this? How much I can thank you for that, because that is often a problem in the immigrant populations.
Yeah.
Where the mother is a little paranoid and she can't barely write English. I mean, barely write Spanish and read Spanish. But if you tell that her daughter is depressed, is going to get on a computer by herself and she can't oversee what she's doing, she's not going to let it happen.
Yeah.
And so that's a wonderful addition to the program. I tried it. I finally read it, and it said it was okay if you're an adult to try it. Just say you're an adult, so that doesn't. I didn't want to mess up your data. And I tried 2 of the interventions. At first, I had to laugh because when you said ABC, I thought that intervention was the ABCs from Jill's book.
Gotcha.
Adversity believes consequences.
Yep.
And that's what I thought I was going to be taught. But the ABCs, for those of you who haven't tried it in the lab, are based on creating a small plan of action based around things that you think you can do. And then the computer somehow creates your plan, and you're supposed to take a screenshot of it and then use that as your guide as to what you're going to do. And so that's the way you're activating. That's the way you're getting people to move.
Yep. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
The other one right next to it, I forget what it's called on the top. It asks more about how you're feeling and goes through what we've talked about, permanence, and whether it's global or just to you. And it helps you build hope.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's
and it's
right.
extremely well done. It was extremely well done. It takes 20 minutes and it's actually enjoyable. I do think the cartoons with a little pig going down the stairs, I didn't get that.
That is something, that is something that we worked with teens to put into there. So it is for teens and built with teens. So it makes sense that
It makes
adults
sense
be
to the
as
teen,
excited
but
about it.
that and the porcupine, I'm like, what? I don't get this.
So to help listeners out a little bit, we have a behavioral experiment embedded into the Action Brings Change project, ABC project, where we ask people to rate their mood on a scale of 1 to 10. We then ask them to pick one of 3 very cute videos that we worked with teens to select based on how much the teenagers on our advisory board liked them and thought that other teens would like them. One of them is of a little porcupine making funny noises and eating a pumpkin. And another one is of a mini micro pig going downstairs and jumping into a pot of oatmeal. And they are meant for teens to enjoy. And then we ask them to rate their mood afterwards, and they get immediate feedback on whether their mood improved. And we can then say, wow, just by watching this 30-second video of a porcupine, your mood improved a tiny amount.
Yeah.
Imagine what could happen if you engaged in activities that you cared about, that you valued, that you enjoyed. So it's kind of a proof of concept to show people by doing that what
Yeah.
you do can shape how you feel.
It is really well done. It is really well done. But for my age and my gender, and
Well,
my life
we would have to
experience,
make a whole different
you
intervention.
have to make another video.
Yeah.
um, so you just finished writing an article. You tried these same interventions in teens right after COVID.
Mhm,
And I think if we're just talking to pediatricians, we don't need to outline the problem.
mhm.
But if we're talking to the population in general, where are we with depression in teens today in America?
Not doing great. The rates of depression in teenagers are just as high, if not higher, as they've ever been. About 1 in 5 teens will experience a major depressive episode before they turn 18. And access to effective depression interventions is terribly low. Although there are evidence-based treatments, most teens who need depression treatment do not access anything at all. Among those who do access it, they're really likely to get it through the pediatricians that they see. They're so unlikely to see a mental health specialist. So I see pediatricians as really being on the front lines of this opportunity to provide evidence-based resources to teenagers. At the same time, that can be really overwhelming for pediatricians who don't necessarily have training or support or anywhere to refer when teens come into their offices struggling with this kind of difficulty. So one of the applications I see for our single session online interventions and single session provider delivered interventions is tools that you can use on the spot, regardless of your training in mental health care or not, to serve the people in front of you when they need help.
The problem with pediatrics is as follows. I'm a general pediatrician, okay? And everybody sees me as a general pediatrician, not a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, or all that kind of stuff, developmental pediatrician, okay?
Right.
From the universities, from the insurance carriers, from every which way, yet everybody's pushing the general pediatricians to do it. While we want to do it, we want to help because we're nice people, it takes a long time.
Yeah.
All right? Psychiatrists don't want to do it. They want to just push drugs.
That's right.
All right. Psychologists are way too busy. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. These psychological issues, we should have access to somebody. Try getting it. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're absolutely right.
Everybody says, not my job.
Exactly.
That's a problem. But this is why this is the brilliance of this idea and this lab, which is I have a depressed teenager in front of me. I am going to put on medications because that's really the only thing I can do. I'm not trained to do much more than that. I'm going to do the risk assessment for suicide, have a safety plan with the parents, and then I can sit there on an empty computer in the hallway, in the waiting room, in the restroom. She can go to her car and say, "Do this," and come back and tell me how you feel. And it's not me doing it; it's an evidence-based application that is going to make some difference. Might not cure her, but it's going to give me something in my belt that I can take out, a tool, and give to this child and their family without it costing me any money and without doing anything that's quacky or crazy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's the beauty of this idea. It's not fair because some insurance plans.
It's a beautiful idea. All right. You know, I'm the guy with work plans and processes, but in the day-to-day activity of the general pediatrician, there simply is no time for it.
And they don't pay for it. I mean, it's
they don't pay for it. There's no time.
for some visits.
Why don't psychiatrists use it? This is their training. They're sitting at home on their computers.
You can't get access to psychiatry in Northern Virginia. We have 3 universities, and to be a pediatric psychiatrist is a 2-year wait. So you might as well, go get gummy bears with marijuana because it ain't going to happen.
So
You got to do something.
in one study that we just finished at Stony Brook, we actually embedded our digital single session interventions into 9 different pediatric primary care sites connected with Stony Brook Hospital. All of these sites were already screening for depression, just as part of the paperwork that kids fill out. So what we set up with these sites is any kid who screened elevated for depression would get immediate access to our online single session programs. The kids got one and the parents got another one. And that way, nothing was really happening in the pediatrician's office. It was just kind of an automatic trigger that would go, and they'd receive them electronically. We compared that to just offering them referrals and resources like pediatricians normally would. What we found was over 3 months across these 9 different sites, about 160 families, the families who got immediate single session intervention access were more likely to use the referrals that we gave them, and they were more likely to actually get an appointment to see a mental health provider. We also know that the evidence-based interventions that the teens got are effective in reducing depression symptoms to at least some degree. So these interventions can mobilize hope, and that ends up having multiple benefits potentially for families. One, it can help the parents feel like change is possible, as well as the kids feel like change is possible. They may be more likely to follow through on the referrals that they do get. And 2, they may have direct effects on the teen's symptoms that they're experiencing. No, it's not a perfect solution, and no, it's not going to solve everything, but it is better than the status quo.
I have to agree with you with that, because we did work with some, I won't say who, some system where they embedded a social worker, a pediatric social worker, that does psychological training and all that kind of stuff, embedded in our offices. All right. Mm-hmm. So when there was a problem, the doctor would walk over, give her a soft handoff.
Yep.
And then, then it would set up, and then it would, it would work. They would do therapy. They would refer. They would, it wouldn't start medicine. It would refer those guys out to psychiatry and so forth. We immediately got them a lot of patients. She got up to 300 patients, bigger than your study. All right. It was working fantastically.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing happened. Grant ran out. Then they couldn't make it financially.
Yep.
Then pulled her.
Yep.
Okay?
Exactly.
That's very common. We live in real life. That's real.
Absolutely. That is real. And that is a huge reason why my lab does what we do, because when grants end, so do these supports typically.
Yep. Yep.
And that's why we've made our interventions permanently and freely available, so that there is no dependency on a grant. There's no dependency on an IRB or a research team. These are things that can be sent to patients and sent to families anywhere, anytime. So making things free is not the same as a good implementation plan. I'm currently working and consulting with Optum and United Health on figuring out insurance reimbursement pathways.
They're the worst.
Well, they have broad reach.
Yeah, they're the worst. You know what? I negotiate all the time with all these characters. They all talk like they want to help, they want to pay, they want to support. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, they never want to do anything. I challenge United Healthcare to help you. They won't.
United Healthcare doesn't even pay for the screening test, which everyone.
It's really upsetting. So, and they're the one who reached out to me.
They will, because they have to make it look good that they're doing something.
You know why they're reaching out, because it's a free program that's evidence. So it's going to put more money in the pockets of their executives, and they get to say that they're addressing the problem.
Yeah, that's all.
Now, but to your point, George, and we've talked to this about this before many times on the podcast, there are people in primary care like Pediatric Trust, Dr. Susan Zerata in Chicago, who have embedded psychologists into their practices. And Gene Marconi did that for many years in Rhode Island, I think. And the key is exactly what Dr. Schleider is describing. You cannot give psychotherapy in the pediatric office. When they succeed, these programs don't get overwhelmed because they do short interventions right in the moment. And then they hand off the patient to a psychotherapist or cognitive behavioral therapist that is going to do the follow-up. When you try to do the cognitive behavioral therapy in your office, which is once a week for 26 weeks, you quickly fill the agenda or the schedule for this provider or clinician, and you're done. You can't help anyone else. So it's how you implement it that makes a difference on whether you succeed or not. So unfortunately, your partner in Long Island didn't read the literature, and so they didn't implement this program appropriately. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It's just got to be done properly.
Yeah.
But to your point, you're right. At $40 a visit, you can't do anything. And seeing 25 and 30 patients a day, we're humans. We just can't do much. And that needs to be addressed not by United Healthcare, but by the US Congress and the legislatures at every state level, because they fund 52% of the healthcare in children. And they're cowards. They don't want to address it because they don't want to cut anything else in order to feed the kids. That's a problem in our society, and we all need to stand together and say, no more, no más. It's time to invest in our children. Anyhow, what was the other problem that you talked about in your study right after COVID and the school closures and the impact they had on the mental health of our children?
So in that study, we were very fortunate to get National Institute of Health funding to do a nationwide trial of online single session interventions to see if we could help reduce adolescent depression through these free online supports. We recruited, or we told teens about the study through Instagram. So we didn't go through healthcare at all. We went straight to social media, which is where kids are, where they hang out, and met them where they're at in order to provide them these interventions on the spot. For that study, and this is really important and has implications, I think, for pediatric primary care practice, we secured a waiver of parent permission requirements from our ethics board. What that means is that parents didn't have to be involved at all in any of this. Teens could self-select, self-refer into the online single session program if they wanted to. What that means is that we got a sample of about 2,500 teenagers with depression across all 50 states in the country within 3 weeks. And half of them identified as racial or ethnic minorities, and 80% of them identified as sexual or gender minorities. And that was simply because, one, we met teens where they're at on social media, and two, we gave them agency to self-refer into low-intensity safe supports without having to involve their parents. So that was one of the first things that we learned from this study, is the importance of offering things directly to teenagers that are really on their own terms within their domain. We then offered the single session interventions, or a control program, basically a placebo single session intervention. It taught about why sharing feelings is a good thing and you should do it. So it kind of sounded therapy-like, but it didn't teach any skills. It didn't teach things we thought would be helpful. And then we followed up with the teens 3 months later to see how they were doing with their symptoms, with senses of hope, etc. And we found that teenagers who received one of our single session interventions actually experienced significant reductions in their depression symptoms over 3 months, significant reductions in their anxiety symptoms, significant improvements in their sense of hope and perceptions that they could solve problems in their lives, and even reductions in restrictive eating behaviors, which we weren't expecting to see. So this was the largest and best confirmation of a study that we've ever done, showing that these interventions, when disseminated on a really broad scale to a wide population of diverse youth, can make a dent in mental health symptoms. So that's basically the summary.
It's a wonderful study. But you mentioned the study, the harm that school closures did to the kids.
Yeah.
Well-being. How big was that impact of isolating them from their peer groups for that long time?
It was terrible. I mean, the teens, if we had the opportunity to talk with a lot of teenagers during the pandemic for our research, as they were going through all of this, and it was horrible. They had no control, no sense of what was going to happen in the future, and no choice. And that's terrible. That's undermining everything that teens are developmentally wired to want to do, which is exert agency, exert a sense of exploring their environment and connecting with peers. That interrupted all these important central developmental tasks for teenagers. And it affected everybody in different ways, but on the whole, it interrupted the exact tasks of being an adolescent. So it was really damaging. And for folks who are already susceptible to things like depression, it just made it a lot worse, really expedited the development of difficulties.
Luckily, COVID's over, but that's one big hole that we dug ourselves into.
Yeah.
That is take a lot of work to remedy. I was interested because I wasn't aware what restricting eating is.
Mm-hmm.
What is restricted eating disorder?
Yeah, so in this big study that we did, one of the outcomes that we measured is called restrictive eating. Restrictive eating is basically controlling what you eat based on worries about gaining weight, worries about appearance, not listening to hunger cues, basically artificially controlling or dieting based on trying to control what you look like. And in our study, we found that 60% of teenagers with depression in our study were engaging in restrictive eating behaviors, which is alarmingly high.
Yeah.
And it's also true that restrictive eating and eating disorder behaviors and symptoms aren't assessed very often in studies of depression and anxiety. So we wanted to include that in our survey battery because it's understudied, and we had a sense that it was very common, which it turned out to be. So the fact that we found that these interventions designed to address depression also helped with restrictive eating, reducing that in teens, that was really exciting, and it's led us to do quite a bit more research on whether single session online interventions can also improve things like body image.
So I'm just very curious, because what's the difference between restrictive eating and anorexia?
Well, anorexia would be a clinically diagnosed extension of restrictive eating over a long period of time.
Okay.
So it's a continuum, right?
It's a continuum.
Anorexia represents a clinical diagnosis.
Okay.
And that diagnosis includes restrictive eating as a symptom.
Okay, so it's kind of like the autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
I can think of it that way, because I've always wondered, that there is a loss of appetite with anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you don't want to get out of bed, you lose your appetite.
Absolutely. Loss of appetite, though, is different from being hungry and intentionally not eating.
And then some of these patients that are depressed, they don't have anorexia, but if they were toddlers, we would say they were very picky eaters.
Yep.
And I often wonder is, what's the aversion? What do they get reflux, and do they get heartburn? What has made them adverse to eating a normal amount of food? And you'll see the kid like, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this, and it's like they have a restrictive diet of things that they will eat. and they won't
Mhm.
touch anything else.
Yeah. So that actually seems to be describing a different disorder or diagnosis called ARFID, avoidant restricted food intake disorder, which
Okay.
is another eating disorder that's recently gained more attention in the research and clinical communities. But avoidant and restricted food intake disorder is really similar in terms of what it looks like, the behaviors to anorexia. But the reasons for avoiding food aren't due to a fear of gaining weight. They're not due to appearance. They're due to aversions to certain sensations. They're worried about reflux. They're worried about how the food will taste or feel. They're worried about choking. All of these other things that cause avoidance rather than the physical appearance. And as it turns out, the treatments for both are pretty similar for ARFID and something like anorexia. But there is an increasing recognition that there are a bunch of different reasons why people could avoid certain kinds of foods and be very picky eaters. And there's huge overlap between depression and anxiety and disordered eating and eating disorders generally. These things really commonly co-occur. That's, evidenced by our sample that of depressed teens, 60% of whom were engaging in restrictive eating behaviors. So I think there are a lot of folks doing great work to understand why that overlap is so high, but I will defer to them. That's not exactly my area of study, but
But
it's
that's a
certainly
great explanation. Thank you. I wasn't aware of the other disorder you mentioned, but you do
Mm,
see it clinically. They're just picky eaters. They're
yeah,
adolescents that are picky eaters, and they're very difficult and they frustrate the parents to no end.
yes.
Um, and so then you have copied from the optimistic child, but you've made it modern and you've called it the bravery exercise in your lab. And
Project Empower.
yes, and
Mhm.
if I understand the concept correctly, you're teaching parents how to teach their children to be resilient.
Yeah, so this intervention is based on a program that was developed by the Yale Child Study Center. And in that program, it focuses on something called parent accommodation of anxiety. What that means is that a lot of the time when parents see their kids anxious or avoidant of things, they'll have a completely understandable urge to swoop in and rescue them. Unfortunately, while that works in the short term in removing the thing that the kid is anxious about, it doesn't allow the kid to have the opportunity to learn how to cope with it, how to manage that difficult emotion independently, how to overcome and bounce back from that difficult situation. So Project Empower is a single session online program for parents that teaches them how to act opposite to that impulse to swoop in and rescue. So you can give your kid more chances to learn that they can deal with more than they think they can, you know, as long as the situation is actually safe. Of course,
Yes,
if there's a tiger chasing your child, you want to, rescue
yes.
the child.
Now,
But most of these situations, school refusal, social anxiety, things like that, there's an opportunity there. And this intervention helps parents take advantage of those opportunities and tolerate the distress that can create in themselves as well.
and so I will say that one is, again, is beautiful. I did it for myself, and the video in there is phenomenal. How to
Yeah.
empathize, as opposed to putting a silver lining on everything. You know
Yep.
how many times males, we're a little dumb. And then second of all, we're physicians, so we only think about solving problems.
Yeah.
And so you tell me that your ear hurts, I'm like, come over here, let me look at it with the otoscope.
Yep.
And that's just the male and doctor brain, they're very messed up. You may only be looking for empathy. You're not looking for me to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I look in there, it's like, no, don't look bad. And this is not as bad as like if you get run over by a truck. And that really hurts. you know
Well, that doesn't help this hurt less.
That's right. And so I thought the video was phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah. So
Phenomenal.
yeah, parents have this completely understandable impulse to want to make things better for their kids right away, immediately. Of course they
Yeah.
do. They don't want
Yes.
their kid to struggle at all, ever, for even a moment.
Yes.
However, instead of rescuing, we encourage and Project Empower parents to consider empathizing and encouraging when their kids are experiencing distress. So empathizing as in seeing the kid's emotion, naming that emotion, and letting them know that emotion makes sense in the context that they're experiencing it in. They're worried about a social situation or going to school. If you were them, you'd be scared too, if
Yeah.
you had that experience, right? All that is empathizing. And encouraging means urging the kid to consider approaching that situation anyway and seeing how it goes, and then talking about it afterwards. So not necessarily just avoiding to eliminate the possibility of any distress at all, but trying it out and seeing how brave they can be in that situation and seeing how it goes.
So I think that is, it's a phenomenal module, if I could call it that.
Yeah.
And the example that you use about co-sleeping and how accommodation can get you in more trouble is one that every pediatrician should go through this, because happens every day in the office. And it's the same thing. It's always the same thing. And it's like, well, you got two choices. You let the kid sleep in your bed. You're not going to sleep for 5 or 7 years till he's tired of sleeping in your bed and they'll go to their own
Right.
room.
Right.
That's okay. That's okay. That works for you. That's okay. Or you're going to have to sweat a lot, because when you put that kid in the other room and you put him in a crib and they're screaming and crying, as a parent, you sweat bullets, and every second seems like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Until you can't take it anymore. You go pick him up and put him in your bed and you go, I can't take it. I gotta get to sleep because I gotta go to work. But I love that example. And then I had a quick question about, are we accommodating too much our youth in our society? And is that a problem with our society?
I think it's a pervasive enough problem for interventions like Project Empower to be relevant, not just for kids who are experiencing clinical anxiety, but for most parents who are navigating how much autonomy and independence and room to grow and to make mistakes parents are giving kids.
Okay.
I don't want to say that every single parent is doing it, or every single parent can improve in this or that way, but I do think there is a lot of pressure on kids to perform perfectly all the time, to excel, to succeed. And that can lead to avoidance of challenges, avoidance of difficult situations, avoidances of situations where you're not totally positive that things are going to go your way. And I do think that, encouraging kids to take risks, approach situations where they're not sure how it's going to turn out, that really is crucial for positive youth development. And I do think it's something that any family could consider doing a little bit more of, or at least reflecting on how that's going.
Yeah, I think we're too accommodating. I think we do have to tell people life is full of challenges.
Yeah.
And it's how you react to the challenge that defines who you are as a human being.
That's right.
And then what is your book? I think it's your third book. I try to get it, but I guess it's not going to be on Apple until September.
Yeah, it's for pre-order right now.
Okay, so I couldn't read it, but the book says Little Treatments, Big Effects.
Mm-hmm.
What do you talk about in that book? And is that geared towards the pediatrician, the parent, or everybody?
It's geared towards everybody. Single session interventions, that is intentionally brief supports that are not expecting people to come back. That's what single session interventions are.
Okay.
People don't know about them.
Okay.
People don't know what they are. Providers don't know what they are. Healthcare leaders don't really know what they are. So naturally, they're not embedded into systems of care. And I wrote this book because I think individuals and systems could benefit from changing that. And the first step to do so is raising awareness. So the book is argues how our mental health care system got so messed up. It goes back to like the asylum era and starts there. It discusses how stigma and systemic problems and systemic barriers have all kind of converged to make mental health care impossible to access. And then I go on to introduce the idea of single session interventions and how they can really fill gaps in the systems we currently have, both to help people who are stuck in between systems, like if they can't access a therapist, and to reach people who never access any care in the first place outside of traditional systems. The book then goes on to tell a lot of people's stories. I put out a call on social media for people who resonated with the idea of having a turning point in their mental health recovery journey.
Okay.
So a single moment that really mattered to them, even though it was just one moment in the context of everything else. And a lot of people felt like they'd experienced one of those.
Oh, wow.
And so I talked to dozens of people, surveyed more than 100 about what were those turning points for you. And the rest of the book is dedicated to how can we use knowledge of what makes a turning point in someone's recovery into creating powerful single session interventions for people to help people have those turning points more frequently and more intentionally. And then there are some activities for people to do at the end that are based on our interventions.
I think that's going to be a fascinating read. I can't wait till I get it.
Thank you so much.
I do have a question about that because you talk about the turning point and people that work with patients struggling with obesity and weight. They also say that they find that their patients have a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that achieve the turning point maintain a healthy weight after that.
Yeah.
The ones that don't find the turning point bounce.
Mm-hmm.
They go from one program to another program, and they do the yo-yo, up and down, up and down.
Mm-hmm.
That is very, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how else can we help you to meet pediatricians and connect you with pediatricians
Well,
so that we can make this reality.
I encourage any pediatricians who are interested in using any of our interventions to either visit our website or contact me. If you have questions about how to incorporate these things, I'm more than happy to chat.
What is the website?
www.schleiderlab.org. SCHLEIDER lab.org.
What have I not asked you that you think it's important for our listeners to know?
Well, I will say also, I do have an 11 o'clock meeting, so I do kind of have to. I'm so sorry. I had budgeted an hour. But asked so many great questions. I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation.
Great. I will introduce you to Leah Gugino and Sue Cressley, because I think you will get more support from the payer side working with these two people.
That would be great.
And maybe maybe we can make a difference in these children's lives.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. And
Absolutely.
enjoy Chicago, and give Renat a big hug from my part.
I certainly will. Okay.
Thank you for listening. This has been a production of the Pediatric Lounge. On the show notes, you will find links to our co-host and other important notes, as well as a timetable of the topics discussed today. Don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to wherever you listen to your podcast. Leave us a great review, as it helps us greatly. In the meantime, we will see you next week. The Pediatric Lounge. The conversations are not intended as medical advice, and the opinions expressed are solely those of the host and the guest.